Welcome back to Most Amazing. Here are the top 10 dark human experiments that went horribly wrong. Yeah, this one's very dark, let's do it. Kicking off the list at number 10, the Aviator Suit. When it comes to new ideas and new inventions, it almost seems messy at first, all the time. It's always a horrible start. And today's list is quite messy, a lot of horrible experiments done with groups of unaware subjects. To kick this grim one off, we'll look back to the early 1900s. We'll start with Franz Reichelt, a known inventor of the time. He invented his own version of a wearable aviator suit. It was a parachute. It was made of 320 square feet of fabric. It wasn't light at all. And in 1912, Franz wanted to test this new invention out in public, but instead of using a dummy and throwing that off the Eiffel Tower, Franz wanted to be brave and he strapped himself in. And the rest is history. Dark, horrible, fast history. Number 9. The Hofling Hospital Experiment. This experiment happened all the way back in 1966, so a bit more recent, in a time where the rules of psychological experiments, well, didn't really exist. Really. I was gonna say they were kind of loose, but no, they were not really a thing at all. Because of this, the nurses that were all part of this experiment had no idea that they were participants, which nowadays is totally illegal, very illegal. The night nurse would receive a phone call during the shift, and on the other end would be Dr. Smith, who's actually the researcher in this scenario. He would ask the nurses to check the medical cabinet to see if they had a drug called astrotin, which was actually a drug that was made up for this experiment, and it was actually just a placebo, so don't worry too much. The astrogen would clearly state the maximum dosage of 10 milligrams, but Dr. Smith would ask the nurses to administer 20 milligrams. They were told that the doctor was in a hurry and he would sign the papers later and all that jazz. This just had to get done that night. This had to be delivered to the patient ASAP. If the nurse decided to give the patient the drug, they would be breaking 3 rules. They're not allowed to accept instructions over the phone, the dose was double the maximum limit stated on the box, and the medicine itself was unauthorized. Big 2. And it was not on the ward stock list, so it shouldn't be used in the hospital in the first place. Big 3 red flags right there. Out of the 22 unknowing nurse participants, 21 of them went to administer this. Yeah, big oof on that one. Yikes. To be fair, that's the entire point of this test. This is nothing towards the nurses. I'm not ripping on them at all. I mean, this was 1966. We didn't know quite a bit back in the day, you know what I mean? This really showed the pressure nurses are put under randomly in the middle of the night, if anything. Number 8, UCLA Schizophrenia Experiment. Starting in 1983, UCLA researchers Michael Gitlin and Keith Neutraline went to great and pretty unethical lengths just to see how people who are suffering from schizophrenia relapse. Yeah, basically they're trying to figure out if there is a way to predict the relapse, or a psychosis episode of some sorts. Now, sounds like a good idea on paper, I guess, but the way you go about things, historically, come on, we could have done a lot better. Unfortunately, this experiment involved recruiting hundreds of participants who were all being treated for schizophrenia at the time, and then just taking them off their meds completely. Yeah, as I said that, you at home probably went, ooh, yeah, that's exactly right. What a horrible idea. Like, we're going the opposite way here. We're not supposed to do this, right? There's no suitable plan and order for when they could return to their medication. And they also didn't do a good job making sure these patients were actually safe during these experiments. They're like, yeah, let's just take people off their meds, see what happens. It's horrible, it's one of the worst. Unfortunately, the results were as bad as you thought and proved to be fatal when one of the participants, Antonio Lamadrid, ended up taking his own life. Again, not sure what we expected here in this sense. An article from 1994 also said the doctors failed to get proper consent from the patients as well. Just a cherry on top of this horrible experiment. Just when you thought it couldn't get worse. There you go. Number 7, psychic driving. British psychiatrist Donald Ewan Cameron is to blame for this one. Remember that name. Don't listen to anything he says. He created the psychic driving concept that the CIA found interesting, to say the least. Basically, psychic driving was a procedure that subjects patients to a continuous, repeated audio loop of something that's intended to change their behavior. Just the same line or the same whatever over and over thousands of times. And through the course of their treatment, they would also be paralyzed while being exposed to the loop message. Yeah, the worst thing ever, right? So the CIA heard about this and started sending money to fund Cameron's experiments, but he actually didn't know it was coming from the CIA because they used a fake name. Classic CIA. Cameron would subject patients to paralytics and electroconvulsive therapy, stronger than usual as well, just to make things worse, just at a horrible limit. The experiments were mostly conducted on patients who entered the institute for more common problems like anxiety disorders or postpartum depression, and they ended up leaving with permanent effects from his actions. These included things like amnesia, being unable to speak. Some people forgot their parents' names and thought that the interrogators were actually their real parents. Just horrible things. Their minds were just so confused. Brutal stuff. Number 6, go pills. Here in Toronto, we have go trains, go buses, but not go pills. Not yet. Hopefully not ever, actually. Yeah, move over 5-hour energy, we got some competition on the horizon. Staying awake is challenging, even when you're doing something you absolutely enjoy, like watching a movie. You'll still fall asleep. It just happens, we're human. My dad fell asleep in a theater once in the moving chairs. I couldn't believe it. Guy's 3D glasses were falling off of his face. I was in shock. But he works a lot. He works crazy hours, he's older. That's where Go pills were supposed to come in handy. Workers who have these long shifts and work late hours to pay the bills. This pill was supposed to keep you up for 40 hours straight, so a bit much, I'd say. The US Defense Advanced Research Project Agency, or DARPA, which is much less air coming out of my mouth, is currently funding this pill. But what if it's mistreated? I can't even begin to imagine the negative effects something like this could have on people. We could barely handle Tide Pods as a community. You know what I mean? It's kind of a bad idea, I vote. Number 5. The Milgram Experiment. When learning about our past in further detail, like the Trinity test for example, and how that led to Hiroshima and Nagasaki, it's important to understand why these things happened and why these people did this, or more so how people are influenced into doing these horrible things historically, especially in large numbers. So the Milgram Experiment was put in place to get an idea. How far will people go when it comes to obeying instructions, specifically if it involves a third party being hurt? Well, Stanley Milgram, Yale psychologist, created this test. There's 3 important roles for this one. You need the teacher, the experimenter, and the learner. The learner is disguised as the main test subject, but really, they're actually in on the whole thing. The real subject is over here. The teacher, the one administering pain to the test subjects. So they're told by this higher figure, whoever, to keep upping the pain every time they get a question wrong. They're like the rule maker. So the real test here is to see how far humans will go when hurting others under direct authority. It's important to note that the subject also isn't actually getting shocked at all. Again, they're in on it. They play it up. They play it up more and more just to see what's going on. These tests were underway in 1961 in a basement at Yale University. In college, I did improv. That's wild. That's a wild after-school curricular activity. Number 4, Unit 731. The Imperial Japanese Army's Unit 731 conducted some pretty horrible experiments during World War II that certainly are going to shock anyone who learns about them. This is wild. This definitely belongs on this list. The experiments were meant to be done as a way to prepare for biological warfare, but the process was horrible and extremely inhumane, as are most of these things. Different medical schools and universities all provided doctors and other research staff to help conduct these experiments. Big group effort, nice, way to go guys. They used both prisoners and civilians as test subjects. There were a bunch of different experiments that were conducted during this time, some of which involved injecting them with pathogens like cholera or anthrax, or operations with just no anesthesia, just weapon testing, all painful stuff, really the worst of the worst. Number 3, mkultra. We have to include a mind control project. Do you believe in mind control? Some claim they're born with it, like an X-Men, so if that's you, you know where to meet. mkultra, where do I start? Okay, it was originally a secret CIA project that lasted from 1953 to 1973, where they ran hundreds of experiments to US citizens. They gave them hallucinogens in an attempt to crack mind control, or sorry, as they called it, information gathering. Yeah, it's like what Apple says. Oh, we're just gathering information. Yeah, okay. In the 50s and 60s, around the Cold War, the United States believed that the Soviets, Chinese, and or North Korean agents were all using mind control in the war. That was their best explanation towards these brainwashed prisoners of war in Korea at the time. Yeah, it's gotta be brainwashing, nothing else, right? Horrible tests were being conducted in universities, hospitals, and again, in prisons. The happenings of these projects weren't fully known to the public until years after it ended. It was a huge, horrible secret. The agency destroyed most MK documents back in 1973 when it officially ended, so we think we know, when in reality we probably know little to nothing what actually occurred. Number 2, the Stanford Prison Experiment. Perhaps the most famous psychological experiment gone wrong. The Stanford Prison Experiment. Let's talk about it. It started August 14th, 1971. It was led by university psychology professor Philip Zimbardo. Again, another university study. My gosh. I mean, to be fair, Hogwarts was also messed up, but Hogwarts wasn't real now, was it? The Stanford Prison Experiment was very real. The experiment took volunteers and divided them into 2 groups. One group of prisoners and one group of guards. And they placed all these volunteers into a fake prison that was created for the experiment, okay? The experiment aimed to see if and how quickly humans would turn evil, under the right conditions of course, with the right amount of power. Yeah, pretty twisted, right? It's basically a group version of the Milgram Experiment. It was a test to try and answer the question of if humans are inherently good or inherently evil. And after just 6 days, we found out. Yeah, 6 days later, the experiment needed to be concluded because the guards began absolutely tormenting the prisoners in the worst ways possible. It really showed the kinds of things humans can be capable of, even after just a short amount of time, less than a week. And humans are like, oh, I'll be evil. And finally, coming in number 1, facial expressions experiment. Yep, a wild one to close her off. The facial expressions experiment. Okay, back in 1924, a psychologist with, you guessed it, the University of Minnesota, classic university stuff, he wanted to conduct an experiment to study facial expressions, right? Sounds pretty harmless so far, dare I say sounds a little silly. More specifically, he wanted to see if everyone's expressions of emotions were all the exact same. Does happiness look the same on everybody? Does sadness? What about fear or shock, disgust, anger? What about those? So he recruited some volunteers from campus and then painted the lines of their facial muscles black. And then he exposed each participant to different stimuli in order to photograph their reactions. He wanted to compare all these results side by side. The stimuli at hand was intense. This guy wanted big reactions. He included showing them adult films, he exposed them to ammonia, he made them touch reptiles, and of course horrible things that I can't talk about here on the tube of you. You know what I mean? Horrible, horrible stuff. All in the name of facial expressions. What an awful experiment, what a dark one. Those are the top 10 dark human experiments that went horribly wrong. If you want a part 2, I'll do it. I guess someone's gotta do it. You guys are sick. I've been your host, Taylor McWaters. See you next time, bye.